This one is leading a decentralized protocol upgrade. Zuko made it in right under the wire. We were worried that he wasn't going to be able to, although it would have been kind of fitting if Zuko did not make it, because Zcash has led a decentralized protocol upgrade over the last year that's involved their global community. We've got two of the members of their global community that were very active in these discussions, Peter Van Valkenburg from Coin Center and Mario Lau from Placeholder Ventures. There he is, the man, the myth, the legend, Zuko in the middle, and Chris Powers, who writes the excellent Dose of DeFi governance related newsletter, is going to moderate the discussion. Chris, I'll let you take it away. Have fun, guys.
Thanks, Ryan, and welcome everyone to the Leading a Decentralized Protocol Upgrade panel. My name is Chris Powers. I write the Governance and Dose of DeFi newsletters. I'm very excited about today's panel because, as Ryan said, we'll have the opportunity to dive deep into a particular project, Zcash, and hear from the different perspectives of the various stakeholders in the ecosystem. Zuko, of course, has led Zcash development from the beginning. Peter, meanwhile, has been a Zcash Foundation board member since inception, and Mario was involved in the Zcash governance process as an investor through Placeholder. Zuko, I want to start with you and provide us some context. Governance is not necessarily the first thing we learn about a blockchain or a cryptocurrency, but it quickly becomes clear how important this formal or informal process is. I think most of the audience is familiar with the governance systems of Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of the drama and challenges kind of in the past. So why don't you start us off with talking a little bit about how Zcash's governance process is similar and different to Bitcoin and Ethereum's.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yep, it's a good question. Bitcoin and Ethereum and Zcash all have the same basic structure of a consensus algorithm in a blockchain, and they all have both on-chain and off-chain governance. And the on-chain governance is the same in all three, which is that everybody has the right and the ability to launch a chain fork. And if people care strongly enough about something and they launch a chain fork, and then the world will find out which idea more people felt more strongly about. And so that's the on-chain governance. And it's the same with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Zcash. And then there's the off-chain governance, which I think of as just a way for people to coordinate and learn in advance of the chain fork, so that if they all find out that they're all in agreement, then they don't need to go through the actual chain fork process. So it's like built on top of the chain fork layer of governance. And that's where the off-chain governance is, where Zcash has innovated a lot. And the big things that I would want people to know about Zcash's off-chain governance are that it's community-led. Like we'll probably talk about the big dev fund allocation that the community has come up with. And that was really interesting that it wasn't initiated or led or decided by the Zcash Foundation that Peter works for, or my company at all. And there's multiple stakeholders that are really independent. So the three of those stakeholders are represented here, but there's more. But unlike a lot of cryptocurrencies out there, there's true independence. Like there's no shared ownership or control, or it's not all people who think the same way. And the last thing I really want everyone to know is that the community has allocated a fire hose of money, like at least tens of millions of dollars, if not a lot more, that they're planning to give out to people to support Zcash. And my company and the Zcash Foundation are ineligible for that. So everyone should know there's a fire hose of money coming that I can't have any of, but you can.
And Peter, the off-chain and on-chain distinction, is a good framing. And obviously you've been involved more in the off-chain components. I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that and how that is similar and different from.
How do you know I'm not running a whole bunch of miners? Actually, no. Well beyond my expertise. I want to preface everything I'm going to say just to say that I'm a board member of the Zcash Foundation, but today I'm not speaking for the foundation. I'm just going to offer my perspective that I bring to the Zcash Foundation board whenever we talk about these issues. And so hopefully you can get an idea of the kind of things that I advocate or agitate for within the foundation, which is a way of advocating and agitating within the larger Zcash community, of course. So the off-chain governance process. I think Zoko's framing is right. The sine qua non, to use a legal term, the absolute determiner of what a protocol will be always ends up being this economic consensus that happens on chain. And that is about the possibility of there being a hard fork and two possible versions, or a series of forks and many versions of the protocol, and then the actual value of the tokens on those forks. And I think, generally speaking, we think of governance in these systems as being the quantifiable result is which network has which tokens that are considered valuable by the general public. So you can look at Ethereum's split between Ethereum Classic and Ethereum, and you can say, okay, this was a governance process. We ended up with two visions of Ethereum, and they're both viable, and they're both still used today. And then, economics partially determines the winners and losers there. I don't think that story is totally over for Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, but more people tend to use Ethereum given the market price of Ethereum as evidence of that fact. So that's that kind of economic consensus layer that is always the ultimate determiner of where a protocol goes. The off-chain governance process, as Zuko referred to it, is something that I like to think, being someone who's trained as a lawyer, is something that happens in the shadow of the economic consensus. So in legal theory, we talk about decisions made in the shadow of the law. So what that means in the legal realm is we know that this is true about contract law. We know that if we go before a judge, this will be the likely probable outcomes of a dispute between two parties in a contract. Maybe we know that this is how trademarks tend to be negotiated. Maybe we know this is how performance of a contract tends to be judged. But usually, almost all activity in human society doesn't end up in court. It ends up where private parties who are subject to the law know that they're subject to the law and decide to take actions that avoid ever coming to a point where you're in front of a court and where the law has to say anything. That's all decision-making in the shadow of the law. And I think of off-chain governance in the Zcash space, as well as Bitcoin and Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies, as all of these private decisions that lots of different people are making, always in the shadow of an ultimate economic decision. And that ultimate economic decision is the truly decentralized part, if the protocol is well-built, open source, and competitively mined, and there's open markets where you can choose to buy or sell the particular cryptocurrency. But of course, the stuff that's happening in the shadow of that decentralized consensus mechanism has this element of centralization. And ideally, you'd find lots of little lumpy parties. I have this topographical metaphor that all I can do to articulate it is say lumpy, which doesn't sound very scientific. But you've got these lumpy parties within the ecosystem, and those are things like the Electronic Coin Company or the Zcash Foundation, or particularly prolific and accomplished core developer. And so this could be the Bitcoin core developers. This could be a company like Blockstream in the Bitcoin space. And I think one area that there's a little bit of difference with respect to Zcash as compared to maybe Bitcoin is we have a smaller community just because we're newer. And I think it's a difficult project that involves some really high tech stuff. So the pool of people who are able to contribute to that might be smaller. And because of that smallness, there's this risk that the lumps are too big compared to the small granular particles in the off-chain governance arena. And that could create some kind of centralization risk, I would say, with respect to how we make these decisions in the shadow of the economic consensus. But I think one thing that the Zcash community has done fairly well to try and mitigate that risk is form actual formal legal entities that have a level of transparency and accountability so that you know what we're agitating for and advocating for that will ultimately either be chosen by the economic consensus or not. And those lumpy entities that are legally identified in a way that maybe they're not so much in the Bitcoin space are things like the public charity Zcash Foundation, 501c3 incorporated, that I'm a board member of, or the Electronic Coin Company, which is a for-profit company here in the US. and soon the Major Grants Review Committee, which will be the recipient of the bulk of the dev fund that Zuko was talking about, because it was important to us at the foundation, but also important to other members of the community who participate in that process, that the big bulk of the dev fund doesn't go to any of the two existing lumpy organizations in the space, but probably to an organization dedicated to filtering that money out to people who are really trying to build privacy protecting tools for financial transactions as individual developers receiving grants.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, one of those additional lumps or parties obviously is investors being involved in the process. So, Mario, I think you bring such a different angle to this conversation. So, curious to know what role governance played in Placeholder's original investment into Zcash, and kind of how does Placeholder look at being active in the governance process of its investments?
Sure. Well, from the very beginning, the partners at Placeholder made a bit of a name for themselves by publicly recognizing and emphasizing the importance of governance in networks such as Zcash. I think as both technological and social systems, these protocols and networks evolve over time. And I agree with what Peter was saying about the ultimate governance mechanism being, people either installing the software or not, or buying and holding the coin or not. But in addition to that, there's a whole range of decisions that need to be made before that. And this is where other forms of governance come into play. And in a way, governance did play a role in Placeholder's investment in Zcash. Placeholder's cryptocurrency portfolio specifically consists of, in addition to Zcash, also Bitcoin and Decred. And for those who are familiar with these three networks, they're very different in their approach to governance. Historically, Bitcoin community has generally been suspicious or preferred to minimize the formalization of human off-chain governance. Decred has taken a very different and sophisticated approach by basically giving coin holders a lot of say through formal voting mechanisms, not only in deciding software upgrades or voting on approving software upgrades or not, but also, just like Zcash in the future will have a development fund, Decred also has a protocol funded treasury, a treasury that is funded through the block rewards, which Bitcoin doesn't have, and thus doesn't have a need for that way of governing how this pool of capital is allocated. So yeah, Decred has basically built a purpose, created a purpose-built discussion and voting platform to basically govern how decisions about the allocation of these funds are made. And again, coin holders have the ultimate say in there. And the way we see it, Zcash really falls in between these two systems somewhere, where there really isn't no formal on-chain governance beyond maintaining the ledger and people deciding to run the software or not. But there is an increasingly decentralized but also formalized off-chain governance, what Peter and Zuko were both describing, involving the ECC, the Zcash Foundation. There's something called the Zcash Community Advisory Panel that has participated in this governance process, and the upcoming creation of a new development fund, which includes the so-called major grants portion that will go out eventually to third-party developers, is a part of that larger system, which will include the Major Grants Review Committee. So taken together, these three networks, we see it as a pretty well-diversified portfolio of potential long-term store of value assets, and it is not by accident that they differentiate themselves in terms of governance.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we think that decentralization and formalization are like opposing things, but I think it's almost like formalizing the lumps I guess, in a way. But speaking of Decred, obviously, I think that's a good corollary. And Zuko, they are probably the most other widely known with a kind of protocol level funding. And I know that there's going to be some kind of changes in the upcoming protocol upgrade that everyone's going to be talking about. So you can talk about those changes and then like kind of the corresponding formality governance structure kind of going forward for the new dev funding.
You're asking me?
Yes, Zuko. Yeah, sorry.
About the new dev fund?
Yeah, and kind of how you balance both decentralization and formalization of that process.
Well, the process of producing, like the process of deciding that there's going to be a new dev fund is what has gone on in the off-chain human discussion for more than a year. And then that's going to be formalized in Zcash's on-chain governance in November when the new rules kick in and an economic majority or economic consensus will or won't adopt
choose
those
to run
rules,
that
and
software.
will or won't opt in to using that software to manage their ledger. All indications are that everyone is in agreement that this is a great rule set, and I don't expect any substantial objectors. In fact, actually, the objectors already chain split off and made a different variant called Ycash, which is a ledger fork of Zcash. So the process has gone on. It took forever. It was really complicated and painful, even though I mostly stayed out of it because it had to be like a community-led thing, and I thought it was important that the rest of the world can't falsely claim that Zuko did it all. So I really tried to stay out of it, but even as much as I tried to stay out of it, it took forever. It was really complicated and painful. The outcome, I think, was fantastic, in my opinion. And again, this is an outcome that was pretty much wholly devised and debated and decided by the community with almost no input from me, but I think they made some great decisions. And the main one, I don't know if this was the thrust of your question, Chris, but so there's two major decisions the community came to. The first was, are they going to allocate more of their money for core support functions like software development, marketing, regulatory relations, education, research, et cetera, et cetera? Or are they going to allocate all of the money to miners? And so that was the first question. And they pretty much quickly, almost everyone except for the Ycashers, settled on allocating 20% of the money for core support functions and 80% for miners. And the Ycashers have a different scheme, which is cool, so check it out. And then the second question was, how will that 20% of the money, which is again a lot of money, it's at least $50 million, if not more, how's it going to be allocated and managed? And that's where the community did this really interesting thing, which is they specified that the majority of it has to go, the largest slice of it has to go to someone other than the Electric Coin Company or the Zcash Foundation in order to further decentralize power and also to draw in more independent contributors of other companies or organizations or individuals or whatever. So that's all super exciting to me. I think it's a great move on the community's part. I'm really relieved because it was really scary not knowing what they were going to do to my baby. And I think they made a really great decision. I think it's fantastic. The result puts Zcash, I think it's kind of like Zcash's competitive advantage. People think of Zcash as a privacy coin, and I think that's silly. When Netscape invented SSL in 1996, that didn't make Netscape the privacy browser for the privacy purposes, and you would switch to MSIE for the non-privacy purposes. No, that was just a necessary feature you had to have in order to use the web for everything. So I think Zcash's biggest competitive advantage versus any other cryptocurrency is this effective decentralized governance system and this self-funding mechanism.
I mean, I think it's still privacy, though. In a world where SSL isn't the default, Netscape should celebrate that it's the one that is pushing that. And I think,
all right, so they're both important.
Yeah, in a world where Zcash is probably one of a handful of projects that prioritizes privacy over other functionality on the blockchain, I think it's important that we keep talking about that, because if we're going to head towards a world where money is increasingly digital and yet ledgers are fully transparent to government surveillance or private surveillance, that's a disaster. So yeah,
that's a really good point.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that in a little bit. Peter, I want to, we talked before how there's, the on-chain governance factor components and then the off-chain governance. And the foundation is involved a little bit in kind of both of those. So you can kind of talk about.
No, it's really, I mean, I would say it's only involved in the off-chain. The foundation doesn't run any substantial number of nodes or miners. It doesn't actively trade Zcash in order to affect the.
But in the event of a fork, I guess.
In the event of the fork, we would be one of the several off-chain players presenting a version of the software that we think best embodies our principles. And the principles of the foundation are that we need publicly created, so using public money, that's why we're a public charity, private financial transaction infrastructure online. Our goal as a foundation is to make sure that as we move into the 21st century further and further, which is not always a great experience right now, I'll have to say, we don't end up in a world where the only way to save money online is to go through an intermediary who's going to surveil you and decide whether you're the right kind of protester or the wrong kind of protester. And so that's the mission of the foundation, is to make sure that that's always possible. So if we came to a point where there's a chain split potential in the future, or where, say, the ECC or some other party out there has presented a version of the software that we think compromises the public availability of a private financial transaction online, we would not support that. But that's going on off-chain. We would then present to the world our version, which might be, which might have discrepancies from the other version because we have these differences. And then again, it is the ultimate decision of the economic consensus to say, I want to use that one, or I don't want to use that one. And the notion that I have here for governance is, it comes a lot from economic theory of competition. So we talk about competitive markets or non-competitive and monopolistic markets in economics. And a lot of people look at the cryptocurrencies and they say, these chain splits hardly ever happen. Is there really a competitive market here for varying ideas as to what Zcash should be or what Bitcoin should be? And my answer is yes. You don't always need to see active competitors, although Ycash is an active competitor right now that split the chain. But yes, it's one small project, and there isn't a field of projects. But I don't think that means that we have a non-competitive vision of what the protocol could be. It simply means that the protocol is contestable, but not necessarily competitive at any given moment. And what I mean by that is Zcash, the client, is open source software. Participation in mining is something that can be done with commodity hardware that you don't need a specialist to access. And markets for buying or selling Zcash, or Ycash for that matter, are generally competitive and widespread. There's several different exchanges and places where you can purchase or sell these things.
And all of our inventions are unpatented.
Yes, no patents, no copyrighted software. And yes, there's a Zcash trademark, but the company and the foundation have committed to using that trademark only defensively, such that nobody can ever unilaterally decide what Zcash is. If there isn't agreement between the foundation and the company, the trademark gets destroyed. It's mutually assured destruction. So the goal here is to reduce the barriers to creating competition for what Zcash should be, such that it would be easy, if the current main line of Zcash ever seemed abusive or incorrect as to the visions of the protocol, it would be very easy and low cost to present an alternative vision. So the fact that there aren't constantly alternative visions to pick from, aside from Ycash and Zcash, doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a contestable market where someone couldn't easily fork the GitHub repository and say, look, what these guys are doing should not be Zcash. I want to do what Zcash is.
Yeah, it's almost like those actions are governed by like the shadow of the hard fork, right? In the same way, like that threat of that ends up actually having a huge effect on people's actions.
That's a great metaphor.
Yeah. Mario, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the role of coin holders in the governance process. Obviously, Zcash does not have coin-weighted votes, right? That's not built in the protocol layer. That's not other blockchains kind of do. I know a lot of investors choose to be pretty hands-off when it comes to governance for fear of kind of stepping on anyone's toes. So, as placeholder looks into the governance space, like how do you guys view this as, a large investor?
Yeah, just like you said, there are networks, a few of them actually, that have established coin holder authority as a fundamental principle in their governance system, basically saying that the ultimate decision-making power, in addition to people deciding to run the software or not, lays with the coin holders in a formalized voting system. And yeah, they've introduced coin-weighted voting mechanisms, which means effectively that the more coins one has, the more decision-making power that entity has. And the dilemma for any large coin holder in such a situation is whether to use their economic or voting power, which may end up swaying votes, or not to use it. And opinions differ on whether such concentrated decision-making power is desirable or even acceptable. Thus far at Placeholder, we have generally minimized our on-chain governance footprint in terms of voting, especially in systems where the votes are weighted based on how many coins you have. So we've limited ourselves to what we like to call off-chain diplomacy. But I think, all investors need to recognize that they are only one stakeholder among others, and in a system where they have a lot of say through voting, in each situation, in each network, they have to basically assess when it makes sense for them to use their coins to participate in voting and when it's not a good idea. If an investor believes that they can make a positive contribution at a key decision-making situation, then if the network allows it, if the protocol allows it, or maybe even encourages it, then it is definitely an option. But I think it's still always important to assess the potential negative impacts of such, let's call it, investor activism.
Yeah, and if Peter or Zuko have any thoughts on-chain voting? Obviously not, right now, but.
So personally, I'm quite wary of coin holder voting. Again, the foundation's perspective and mine that I fight for on the foundation is that this needs to be public infrastructure for private financial transactions above all. And that means that we might want a technology that works better, but reduces the value of Zcash. I mean, there are caveats there. If Zcash is the means by which miners maintain the protocol or rewarded for maintaining the protocol, Zcash cannot have a low or non-value, obviously, because the network would not be maintained. And if developers aren't incentivized to present alternative visions of Zcash or additions to the protocol by the thought that this thing will remain valuable to them as a token, then we won't get new science and new engineering. But I am wary of people, and I'm not accusing anyone, certainly not Mario, of this, but I am wary of the notion that just because you hold a lot of the coin, your incentives are aligned with the vision of the protocol. Because your primary incentive will often be to see the value of your holdings go up. And in the long term, that might be incentive compatible with privacy, because people will only want to use Zcash if it is the private cryptocurrency, if it delivers on its engineering promises and on what it wants to see emerge in the world. But in the short term, that might not be the case at all. In the short term, the price might go up because of something that compromises privacy. So formalizing the role of coin holders and giving them a lot of weight in the discourse is something I'm wary of. Again, I want as many lumps in the granular spread of the community as possible. So coin holders should definitely find a way to get their voice heard and make sure they're heard. But I'd be wary of privileging that over, of course, what I think is fundamentally important to the Zcash protocol, which is building good privacy protecting software.
For what it's worth, I kind of disagree, but I mostly agree. So what I disagree about, like everything Peter said, I agree with. What I disagree about is that I think currently in Zcash, coin holders are underrepresented. All of the off-chain governance that we described doesn't give placeholder, for example, any explicit formalized channel to express their voice. And I think that's a mistake. I think success involves getting more, like Peter said, more lumps, and also getting lumps to work together who have mostly aligned but not completely aligned goals. On the other hand, I mostly actually really agree with Peter that the larger sort of gestalt or whatever is really shared among almost everyone involved is probably more important in a certain way in the long run. And for Zcash, that's clearly the human-centered mission, right? At the Electric Coin Company, we say our mission is to empower people with economic freedom. And more or less everyone who has anything to do with Zcash, and that's a lot of people, are here for the mission. It's something that everyone feels strongly. And like Peter said, we feel it more and more strongly as it looks like society needs an alternative more and more.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's the process of formalizing on-chain and off-chain, but kind of going back and, maintaining privacy at the center. Mario, I wanted to kind of return to the theme of investor governance right quickly, but as we've got a couple of minutes left here, and just wonder, is there an ROI on governance investor? Like, is that something that more VCs should, spend time researching, getting involved, and kind of doing that? How do you see that as a investment from the VC perspective of your time?
Right. Well, I think it's a very difficult thing to quantify, first of all. The way I define governance is basically any design feature or any control mechanism that helps to steer the system as it evolves, over time. So this includes the way the protocol is designed. It's part of governance, I think. So in this very broad, under this very broad definition of governance, I think it's obvious that the way a particular network or protocol is governed plays like a key determining role in whether it succeeds or not. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's very important. So in that sense, I do think investors, but also anyone using Zcash or other protocols should have an interest in governance. Yes.
Yeah, and we just a couple minutes left. So Zuko, I wanted to returning to the shadow of the law and kind of this idea of actions being done without an explicit direction. It reminds me, I guess, of another concept of legitimacy and governance legitimacy, right? And so how are you kind of looking at why and how the Zcash governance process is legitimate?
That's a great question. That's really the essential question, because that's kind of like the one bit that everyone in the broader world cares about with regard to governance, right? Whether they want to estimate for themselves whether they think it's like a scam or some kind of exploitation or some kind of abuse, or whether they think it's a legitimate sort of expression and evolution of the community. To my mind, what we started with is the real answer. Like, everything else builds upon the legitimacy of the possibility of chain forking. And along the way, we at Zcash have worked really hard, and in my opinion, really successfully, to preserve legitimacy in all of the off-chain parts by transparency, separation, like true independence of organizations, checks and balances, and including many voices from the community into the decision process, and memorializing the rationale and how different people's opinions were and weren't honored by each step. Does that answer your question? Like, the real source of it is that it's an open permissionless system and it's all opt-in. And all the off-chain stuff that we've done doesn't supplant that layer. It just builds on top of that layer, the chain fork layer. But in addition, like, let me just tell a little anecdote. About 9 months ago, I think, I was sitting around a table with a bunch of people that I won't name from 4 other major blockchain, like layer ones that you know of. And I was talking about the Zcash Foundation, my partners over there, who were like disagreeing on some step of the process or some policy goal or something. And they said something like, well, why don't you just make them comply or whatever? It was like, because I have no ability to make them comply. They have their own opinions and they're completely independent. And all 4 of these other major layer 1 blockchains that I can't name, they said, really, that's great. We wish we had independent parties in our system that were actually not controlled by the same people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think legitimacy is created; it's earned, like kind of, over time. Yeah, and Peter, just to kind of close it out here, obviously Zcash is at the core and the foundation of financial privacy. But as you were talking about earlier, there's a lot of other areas where there's a lot of development. So how do you kind of think about how Zcash fits into the other areas of financial privacy, and what are the other allies or privacy allies that can be brought into the Zcash governance ecosystem?
Yeah, so my day-to-day work is not necessarily being on the board of directors for the Zcash Foundation, which is just, I have fiduciary. I make sure our executive directors are doing what we want. My day-to-day work is at Coin Center, which is a different nonprofit that educates people in DC about how cryptocurrencies work, and advocates for their acceptance as something that should be good for America, effectively, is one way of thinking of it. And the thing that I keep going back to with respect to the privacy aspects and the censorship-resistant aspects of cryptocurrencies is, unless you're transacting in cash, you end up on a list when you pay somebody. All the time, always on a list. If you use Venmo, if you use a bank, if you use a wire transfer, you end up on a list. Now, that list might not be the US government's list or the People's Republic of China list, but it could very easily become their list. In the US, for example, if Venmo has records about all my transactions, the government is allowed to get those records without a warrant. That's just the way constitutional law and financial surveillance works in DC. So Ryan's playing me off with my triumphant song for financial privacy. But I think that needs to be our #1 mission, is making sure that there's technology that means you don't end up on a list just because you want to pay somebody for something in the world. That's essential. And to that end, I think one thing that we could do better in the Zcash community, I'd like to see more people emerge to do it, is we need more advocates. Like the Electronic Frontier is a great advocate for internet freedom. We need more advocates for financial privacy, because cash is dying. Everyone's paying online. They end up on lists. And obviously the geopolitical situation of the world is not great right now. And I wouldn't want to be on a lot of people's lists.
Well said.
Gentlemen, that, Peter,
Word.
I couldn't play you off with an acoustic guitar, right? And unfortunately, I don't have my electric here, because that really required a Fender or something heavier.
Honestly, for financial privacy, you need to play me off with a violin.
I can't play a fucking Rage Against the Machine song with an acoustic guitar, man.
Everyone cares.
Next time we do one, we'll do it properly. Gentlemen, this is great. Thank you so much. And obviously a fan of all your work on Zcash and the community more generally. So rock on.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, guys, thanks.